the beast in the night. The moon hung low in the sky, full and swollen, casting a pale, sickly light over the dense, silent forest. The trees swayed like dark, ancient sentinels as a cold wind swept through them, carrying the scent of damp earth, decay, and something far more sinister, a hint of blood, sharp and metallic. The shadows moved, shifting and alive, as if the forest itself were breathing, waiting, watching. And then it came, a hulking figure, moving through the trees with a feral grace, its massive form barely visible in the darkness. The werewolf. It was a creature born of nightmares, its fur black as midnight, its eyes burning like embers in the gloom. Muscles rippled beneath its skin, each step deliberate, each movement filled with purpose. It was driven by a rage that had festered for centuries, a wrath that had grown deeper and darker with every moment of its imprisonment. Now it was free to unleash its fury upon the world once more. The werewolf moved silently, its nostrils flaring as it caught a scent on the wind, something new, something human. It paused, its ears twitching, its eyes narrowing. Ahead, just beyond the trees, lights flickered. The distant glow of an isolated town, nestled in a valley at the forest's edge. The werewolf's lips curled back in a snarl, a low growl rumbling deep in its throat. It stepped out from the cover of the trees, its massive paws sinking into the wet earth, leaving deep, clawed imprints behind. The beast had only one thought: destruction. This town, this pathetic cluster of human lives, would be the first to feel its vengeance. As it approached, the faint sound of an engine rumbled in the distance, a patrol car slowly making its way down the narrow road that wound through the woods. The werewolf's head snapped in the direction of the sound, its eyes narrowing, its ears twitching. The car drew closer, its headlights cutting through the darkness, revealing the beast for a brief, terrible moment. Inside the patrol car, Officer Jackson leaned back in his seat, one hand lazily resting on the steering wheel, the other holding a cup of lukewarm coffee. His partner, Officer Harris, sat beside him, half asleep, barely paying attention to the dark stretch of road ahead. "Nothing ever happens out here," Jackson muttered, taking a sip of his coffee, his eyes scanning the trees. "Why do we even bother with these late-night patrols?" Harris yawned, shrugging. "Gotta keep the peace, I guess. Not much else to do in this dead-end town." But then, something caught Jackson's eye. A flicker of movement in the distance, something large and dark crossing the road. He squinted, leaning forward, and felt a chill run down his spine. "Hey, did you see that?" he asked, his voice suddenly tense. Harris sat up, rubbing his eyes. "See what?" "They're in the trees," Jackson said, pointing. "Something's out there." Before Harris could respond, the patrol car's headlights illuminated the shape on the side of the road. A massive, black-furred figure standing on two legs, its eyes glowing like hot coals. The werewolf stared at them, unblinking, its lips curling back to reveal sharp, glistening fangs. "What the hell?" Harris gasped, his voice filled with disbelief. Jackson's hand moved to his radio, but before he could speak, the werewolf moved. It leapt forward with impossible speed, crashing into the front of the patrol car with a force that shattered the windshield and crumpled the hood like paper. The vehicle lurched sideways, skidding off the road and slamming into a tree with a sickening crunch. Jackson and Harris were thrown forward, their bodies jerking violently against their seatbelts. The car's horn blared, a harsh, continuous wail, as smoke began to billow from the engine. Jackson groaned, blood done trickling down his forehead, his vision blurred. What is that thing?" The werewolf growled low, a sound that rumbled deep within its chest, vibrating through the air. It reached in through the shattered windshield, its massive claws wrapping around Harris's throat. Harris let out a choked scream as the beast yanked him from the car, its claws digging deep into his flesh. "No, no!" Jackson shouted, fumbling for his gun, his hands shaking. He managed to draw it and fire, but the bullets seemed to do nothing, pinging harmlessly off the werewolf's thick hide. The creature didn't even flinch. It tightened its grip on Harris, lifting him into the air effortlessly. Harris's eyes widened with terror as he stared into the werewolf's glowing eyes, its snarling more, inches from his face. "Please, please," he begged, his voice a strangled whisper. The werewolf didn't hesitate. It snapped its jaws closed, biting down on Harris's neck with a sickening crunch. Blood sprayed into the night, a crimson mist that hung in the cold air. The beast tossed Harris's limp body aside, his neck broken, his eyes staring sightlessly at the moon above. Jackson's heart pounded in his chest. He knew he was next. He tried to crawl out of the car, his legs numb, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Please, don't," he whimpered, his voice filled with desperation. The werewolf turned its gaze to him, a low growl rumbling in its throat, a sound that sent a shiver down his spine. It moved slowly, deliberately, savoring the moment, its claws scraping against the asphalt. Jackson knew there was no escape. He could feel the cold hand of death closing in around him, could feel the primal fear that gripped his soul. He raised his gun again, his hand shaking so badly that he could barely aim. The werewolf lunged. Jackson fired, but the shot went wide. The beast's massive paw struck him across the chest, ripping through his uniform, tearing flesh from bone. Jackson's scream was cut short as the werewolf's jaws clamped down on his shoulder, its fangs sinking deep. The beast shook him like a rag doll, blood pouring from his wounds, bones snapping like twigs. It tossed him aside, his body crumpling to the ground, lifeless, another victim claimed by its fury. The werewolf stood over the broken bodies, its breath steaming in the cold night air, its fur matted with blood. It let out a roar that seemed to shake the very trees, a sound of pure, unbridled rage and triumph. The beast turned its gaze towards the distant lights of the town, a low growl rumbling deep in its throat. There was more blood to be spilled, more vengeance to be unleashed. The centuries of imprisonment had fed its fury, and now that fury would not be contained. With a final snarling grin, the werewolf bounded forward, moving with unnatural speed, its eyes locked on the isolated town that lay vulnerable before it. Tonight, evil would reign, and nothing could stop it. The town of Grey Ridge lay nestled in a shallow valley, its few streets and small cluster of homes bathed in the soft, muted glow of streetlights. It was a place forgotten by time, where life moved at a leisurely pace, and the darkness of the forest beyond was just another part of the landscape. The residents had long grown accustomed to the isolation, finding comfort in the quiet, the predictability of their lives. Tonight, most of the town was asleep, the lights in their homes dim or extinguished, the streets empty save for the occasional patrol car that made its rounds. It was just another peaceful night in Grey Ridge, a town untouched by the chaos of the outside world. But the peace was about to be shattered. The werewolf stood at the edge of the town, its eyes glowing with a malevolent fire as it surveyed the rows of houses before it. The beast's chest heaved with each breath, its mind consumed by centuries of rage, of hatred that had festered and grown in the darkness of its prison. Now free at last, it would have its revenge, not just on the witch who had bound it, but on all those who lived in this world that had forgotten the old ways, forgotten the fear that once gripped humanity. Could this small, sleepy town satisfy the fury that burned within the werewolf? The beast snarled, its lips curling back to reveal rows of gleaming, razor-sharp teeth. This town, with its quiet streets and sleeping residents, would be the first to feel the full force of its wrath. The werewolf threw back its head and howled, a sound so deep, so powerful, that it seemed to reverberate through the very earth. The howl echoed through the valley, a harbinger of the destruction that was about to be unleashed. The beast leapt forward, its massive form moving with terrifying speed, its claws digging into the earth as it bounded toward the nearest house. It was an old, creaking structure, its paint peeling, its windows dark. Inside, a family of 4 slept soundly, unaware of the terror that was about to descend upon them. The werewolf crashed through the front door with a force that splintered the wood and shattered the frame. The noise jolted the family awake, their hearts pounding as they struggled to make sense of the chaos. Before they could even move, the werewolf was upon them, a blur of fur and fangs. The father, bleary-eyed and confused, stumbled out of bed, only to be met with the sight of the beast towering over him, its eyes burning with hatred. He had no time to react before the werewolf lunged, its jaws snapping shut around his throat, silencing his scream in an instant. The mother's scream rang out, piercing the night as she clutched her children to her chest, but the werewolf showed no mercy. It tore through the family with savage brutality, its claws slashing, its fangs ripping through flesh and bone. The house was filled with the sounds of destruction, the crash of furniture, the shattering of glass, the wet, sickening sounds of blood and death. Outside, the town began to stir. Lights flickered on in neighboring houses as the screams and the noise reached the ears of the sleeping residents. Doors creaked open, and bleary-eyed townsfolk peered into the darkness, trying to understand what was happening. But the werewolf was already moving on, its bloodlust not yet sated. It burst from the ruined house, its fur matted with blood, its eyes burning with an unholy fire. The beast leapt toward the next house, crashing through a window, sending shards of glass flying. The occupants inside barely had time to register the threat before the werewolf was upon them, tearing through them with a fury born of centuries of confinement. Screams filled the night, mingling with the sounds of destruction. The town came to life in a frenzy of fear and confusion. People stumbled from their homes, some clutching makeshift weapons, kitchen knives, baseball bats, while others simply ran, their minds gripped by a terror they could not comprehend. A few tried to fight back, their faces pale with fear, but determined to protect their loved ones. They swung their weapons wildly as the werewolf approached, but their efforts were futile. The beast was unstoppable, a force of nature, a vessel of pure, unrelenting evil. It tore through them with ease, its claws rending flesh, its jaws snapping bones with terrifying precision. The streets of Greyridge were soon painted red, the bodies of the fallen littering the ground, their blood seeping into the cracks of the pavement. The werewolf moved from house to house, leaving nothing but death and destruction in its wake. It reveled in the chaos, the fear, the screams that filled the air like a symphony of despair. The town was dying. The realization spread through the few remaining survivors like a cold, paralyzing wave. There was no hope, no escape from the terror that stalked their streets. The werewolf was relentless, driven by a hatred so deep that nothing could stand in its way. It was a force of destruction, a nightmare made flesh. As the night wore on, the town of Greyridge was reduced to a smouldering ruin. Houses stood in tatters, their windows shattered, their doors torn from their hinges. The streets were strewn with debris, the bodies of the dead lying in twisted, broken heaps. The once quiet town was now a scene of pure destruction, a testament to the werewolf's fury. The beast stood in the center of the town, its chest heaving with exertion, its eyes still burning with that same unquenchable fire. It howled again, a sound that carried far into the night, a declaration of victory, of vengeance served. The werewolf had claimed its first victims, but it was not yet done. Its hunger was far from satisfied. The beast turned its gaze towards the horizon, where the dark forest met the edge of the world. Somewhere out there, more lives awaited, more blood to be spilled, more terror to be unleashed. The werewolf licked the blood from its jaws, its eyes narrowing with anticipation. With a final, snarling grin, it bounded away from the ruins of Grey Ridge, disappearing into the night, leaving behind a town that would never wake again, its name destined to be whispered in fear, a warning of the darkness that still roamed the earth. A call for help. The morning sun crept over the horizon, its light casting long shadows over what was left of Grey Ridge. The town was a smouldering ruin, a graveyard of twisted metal, shattered wood, and lifeless bodies strewn across the streets. Smoke rose in thin, black tendrils from the remnants of houses that had been burned to their foundations. The air was thick with the acrid smell of blood, smoke, and despair. Police cars and ambulances lined the main road, their flashing lights casting an eerie glow on the destruction. Officers moved through the wreckage, their faces pale and stunned, trying to make sense of the horror that had unfolded. The quiet chatter of radios filled the air, their static-laden voices punctuated by the occasional gasp or muttered curse. Sheriff Tom Harper, a veteran lawman with salt and pepper hair, and a face lined by years of hard living, stood at the center of it all, his expression grim. He stared at the remains of the town, his eyes scanning the scene, trying to piece together what could have done this. It looked like a bomb had gone off, but there were no signs of fire or explosion, only claw marks, deep gouges in the earth, and a blood trail leading to the edge of the woods. "Never seen anything like this," muttered a young deputy standing beside him, his voice shaky. "Not in all my years." Sheriff Harper sighed, rubbing his temples. "Ain't natural, that's for sure, but I'll be damned if I know what we're dealing with here." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "But there's someone who might." The deputy frowned, confused. "Who, Sheriff?" Harper turned, looking over the devastated town, and spoke softly, as if summoning a name from a forgotten legend. "Jonas Creed," he said. "An old hunter. They say he's taken down things most folks would never believe, creatures that make this mess look like a picnic." The deputy blinked. "Jonas Creed? I thought he was just a story, a ghost tale people told to scare their kids." The sheriff chuckled, a grim smile on his face. "Oh, he's real all right. And he's as mean and tough as they come. But we haven't called on him in years. Folks like to think they don't need a man like Creed anymore. Thought we could solve all our problems with computers and fancy gadgets. Maybe we've gotten too soft for what's out there in the dark." He turned to another officer. "Send a car out to Creed's place. Tell him we need his help." The officer nodded, though he looked unsure. "You really think he'll come, Sheriff? Last I heard, he's been living out there on that old farm, drinking himself to death." Sheriff Harper shrugged. "If anyone can deal with this, it's him. And if he won't come, then God help us all." The car bounced and rattled along the dirt road, a plume of dust trailing behind it as it wound its way through the dense woods. The driver, a young officer named Mike, gripped the wheel tightly, his eyes focused on the narrow, winding path. He had heard stories about Jonas Creed his whole life, stories of a man who had hunted things that should not exist, things that haunted the darkest corners of the earth, but he had never expected to meet him. He pulled up to an old, broken-down farmhouse at the end of the road. The place looked abandoned, its windows boarded up, the paint peeling and faded, the roof sagging in places. A rusted pickup truck sat in the overgrown yard, its tires flat, and its body coated with a thick layer of dirt. Mike hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the wind rustled through the tall grass. He approached the porch, the wood creaking under his boots, and raised his hand to knock on the door. Before he could touch the wood, the door swung open, and the cold barrel of a shotgun was thrust into his face. Mike froze, his heart hammering in his chest. "Who the hell are you, and what do you want here?" growled a deep, gravelly voice from behind the gun. Mike swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He looked past the barrel and saw a man standing in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, his face weathered and scarred from years of hard living. His hair was silver, his beard thick and untamed. His eyes were like ice, cold, calculating, and hard as steel. This was Jonas Creed. Sheriff Harper sent me, Mike stammered. He said we need your help, sir. Something terrible happened in town last night. Something we can't explain. Creed didn't lower the gun, his eyes narrowing. Thought you folks had given up on men like me, he said, his voice a low rumble. Thought you could handle everything from behind your fancy desks, sipping your spiced lattes and playing with your gadgets. Mike tried to keep his voice steady. Sir, please, the town's gone. Everyone's dead. We don't know what did it, but it was something bad. Creed's lips curled into a grim smile, a humorless laugh escaping his throat. Something bad, huh? Well, you ain't wrong about that. He paused, considering for a moment, then sighed. But I'm too old for this. Get someone younger, someone who still believes in your shiny new world. I've done my time. Mike's desperation showed on his face. Please, Mr. Creed. The sheriff says you're the only one who can help us. We need you. The town needs you. Creed studied the young officer for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he lowered the shotgun, a weary sigh escaping his lips. All right, he muttered. I'll take a look, but don't expect any miracles. Mike nodded, relieved. Thank you, sir. Thank you. We'll get you whatever you need. Creed turned, heading back inside, his voice carrying over his shoulder. What I need is for you to stay out of my way. Now go back to your car and tell Harper I'll be there when I'm ready. He disappeared into the darkness of the farmhouse, leaving Mike standing alone on the porch, his heart still racing. As he turned to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were waking something old, something dangerous, and whatever it was, they would need all the help they could get. Jonas Creed stood in the dim light of his farmhouse, a silhouette against the cracked and weathered walls. He was a man carved from stone, his face a rugged map of scars and lines that told the story of a lifetime spent facing darkness. His eyes, cold and grey, held a hardness that came from seeing things no man should ever see, things that had left their mark not only on his skin, but on his very soul. His hair, once jet black, was now streaked with silver, and his beard, thick and unruly, framed a mouth set in a grim line. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if weighed down by the memories of battles fought and demons slain. His hands, large and calloused, bore the signs of countless encounters with creatures that most would consider mere legends. Each finger was marked by small, pale scars, the skin thickened by years of gripping knives, guns and other weapons meant to kill the things that lurked in the dark. Creed walked over to an old wooden cabinet, its doors creaking as he pulled them open. Inside, a collection of weapons gleamed faintly in the half-light. He reached in, his fingers brushing over the familiar shapes. Shotguns, revolvers, crossbows, silver-tipped arrows, knives with blessed steel blades, and an assortment of vials filled with strange liquids. His arsenal was a testament to the years he'd spent hunting things that defied reason and science, things that had no place in a sane world. He pulled out a large duffel bag from the bottom of the cabinet and began methodically loading it with weapons. A sawed-off shotgun, a silver-inlaid revolver, a combat knife with a jagged edge. Each piece felt heavy in his hand, each piece a reminder of what he once was, a man who had stood against evil and survived, again and again, until the weight of it all had become too much to bear. Creed's gaze drifted over to the far corner of the room, where an old tarp covered something large and bulky. He strode over and yanked the cover off, revealing a car that had not seen daylight in many years. It was a classic, a 1970 Dodge Charger, its paint a faded black, the chrome dulled with age. The car had been heavily modified over the years, the windows were reinforced, the tyres thick and rugged, the engine tuned for power and speed. A few custom panels hid compartments where weapons could be stored, and a heavy steel grille covered the front, designed to withstand impact. He ran a hand over the hood, a small smile touching his lips for the first time in years. "Oh, Betsy," he muttered. "Haven't taken you out in a long time." He opened the driver's door with a creak and slid into the seat, the leather worn but familiar. For a moment, he just sat there, gripping the wheel, his fingers tapping against it in a slow, rhythmic pattern. He looked out through the cracked windshield at the overgrown yard, the trees swaying in the breeze. "What are you doing, you old fool?" he muttered to himself, his voice low and rough. "You're past it. Got nothing left to give. You should have stayed in the bottle. Let the world sort itself out." But even as he spoke, he could feel a familiar pull, a calling he thought he had left behind. His gaze drifted to the rearview mirror, where his own eyes stared back at him, hollow and tired. "Maybe I need some help," he said, a grim smile crossing his lips. "Eldridge, you old bastard. You still out there? Sure could use some of your help right now if things are as bad as they say." Eldridge, a name he hadn't spoken in years. A vampire, old as time, with a face like a forgotten painting, faded and cracked. A creature who had somehow found a strange friendship with Creed over years of bloodshed and mutual respect. They had fought side by side once, against horrors that had crawled out of the shadows, and Creed knew that if anyone still walked that thin line between light and darkness, it was Eldridge. He sighed. "I'll take a look first," he muttered, turning the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered, coughed, and then roared to life, its deep growl filling the stillness of the farmhouse. The old car shook slightly, its tyres settling into the earth. Creed looked into the rearview mirror again, staring at his own reflection, the grey in his beard, the lines etched into his face, the eyes that had seen too much. "Old, weak, washed-up Jonas," he said softly, his tone mocking. "What are you going to do to evil, huh? Roll up in a wheelchair and hope it takes pity on you?" He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head, but even as he mocked himself, he could feel something stirring within him, an old fire that had never truly gone out. He knew he was not the man he once was. He knew his best days were behind him, but he also knew there was a reason they had come to him, and not to some young hotshot with a shiny badge. "Maybe there's a little fight left in you, old man," he muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. "Maybe just enough." He reached over, grabbing the duffel bag from the passenger seat and unzipping it just enough to see the glint of metal inside. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the years pressing down on him, but also had the familiar thrill of the hunt, the taste of danger on his tongue. He shoved the car into gear, the tyres spinning briefly in the dirt before finding traction. The Charger lurched forward, out of the shadows of the farmhouse and onto the road, its engine growling like a caged beast, eager to be unleashed. "All right, you son of a bitch," Creed muttered under his breath, staring down the road toward the ruined town. "Let's see what you've got." The old car roared down the dirt road, kicking up dust as it barreled into the darkness, toward the unknown, toward whatever horror awaited in the wake of the werewolf's wrath. Jonas Creed had been at the town of Grey Ridge for hours, moving methodically through the ruins like a ghost, his eyes scanning the carnage with a practiced, unflinching gaze. The air was thick with the scent of smoke, blood and fear, a tangible, oppressive thing that hung over the town like a shroud. Bodies lay strewn across the streets, their faces twisted in terror, their wounds deep and vicious. The destruction was absolute. No house left untouched, no street spared the wrath of whatever had torn through this place in the dead of night. Creed crouched beside a mangled body, his fingers lightly tracing the claw marks that cut through flesh and bone. His face was grim, eyes narrowed, taking in every detail. He could see the depth of the gouges, the way the wounds had been inflicted with deliberate, brutal force. He stood slowly, his knees cracking from age, and moved to the side of a ruined car, examining the deep scratches along its side. The glass shattered, the metal bent and twisted. After a while, he walked up to Sheriff Harper, who was standing near the edge of the town square, his face pale and drawn, his hat pulled low over his eyes. Harper turned as Creed approached, his expression a mix of hope and fear. "Well?" Harper asked, his voice heavy with worry. "What are we dealing with here?" Creed spat on the ground, wiping his hands on his worn jeans. "Yep, it's a lichen all right," he said, his voice a low growl. "A big one. Something different about this one. Never seen a lichen take down a whole town before. This is strange, though. Feels different. Feels wrong." Mike, the young deputy, frowned and stepped forward, looking confused. "What's a lichen?" he asked, his voice tinged with nervous laughter, as if he hoped it was some kind of joke. Creed turned to him, his expression dead serious. "It's a big, hairy, smelly dog, but with a mean streak a mile long," he replied. "Some folks call them werewolves." Mike chuckled, thinking Creed was trying to lighten the mood, but the laughter died in his throat when he saw the look on Jonas's face. Creed wasn't joking, he was deadly serious. "A werewolf," Mike stammered, disbelief in his eyes. "Like from the movies?" Creed shrugged. "More or less. Only this one ain't like the stories you hear. It's big, it's bad, and it's got a taste for blood. And from what I can see here, it's a lot meaner than the usual kind." Sheriff Harper rubbed his temples, trying to wrap his mind around what Creed was saying. "What do we do then, Jonas? How do we stop it?" Creed smirked, his eyes never leaving the claw marks on a nearby wall. "I'm gonna track it," he said simply. "Been doing this a long time. Don't need you or your boys getting in my way. If I need help, I'll yell, but don't send your men after it. This one's different. Strange, evil somehow." Harper frowned, trying to find the right words. "We can offer backup, support, hell. We can call in the National Guard if we have to." Creed snorted, spitting again on the ground. "If I need a soy latte, I'll call you," he snapped. "Just stay out of my way, Sheriff. This is my fight." The sheriff sighed, knowing better than to argue. "All right, Jonas," he muttered. "But if you need anything..." Creed didn't wait to hear the rest. He turned and started walking, his eyes scanning the ground, looking for signs, for tracks. His movements were precise, deliberate. He was in his element now, hunting. He moved past the shattered windows and broken doors, his boots crunching on the glass and debris, his hand resting on the hilt of a silver knife hanging from his belt. The tracks were fresh, clear, deep paw prints in the soft earth. The claws, long and sharp. The beast had moved fast, but not without purpose. It was heading towards the forest, toward deeper shadows. Creed felt a familiar thrill, the rush of the hunt, building in his veins, the fire in his belly awakening after so many years. He followed the tracks out of the town, moving with the silent confidence of a predator, his senses sharp, alert. The woods loomed before him, dark and foreboding, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. He paused at the edge of the forest, glancing back at the ruined town, the bodies, the devastation. "What are you up to, you old fool?" he muttered to himself, his voice low. "Chasing shadows in the dark, thinking you still got what it takes." But there was no turning back now. He knew that much. Something had come back into the world, something that should have stayed buried, and he was the only one who knew how to deal with it. He took a deep breath, tightened his grip on the knife, and stepped into the woods. The darkness swallowed him whole, the trees closing in around him, the shadows deepening. He moved with a purpose, following the scent, the tracks, the signs. He was on the trail now, and nothing was going to stop him. His eyes scanned the path ahead, every sense alert. The wind whispered through the leaves, carrying with it the faintest hint of something rotten, something foul. He knew the beast was out there, waiting, hunting, just like him. "All right, you big ugly son of a bitch," he muttered under his breath, a grim smile spreading across his face. "Let's see what you've got." And with that, Jonas Creed plunged deeper into the darkness, in pursuit of the beast, the scent of death heavy in the air, the thrill of the hunt pounding in his veins. Jonas Creed tracked the creature for hours, moving through the dense, dark woods with a determination that defied his age. He felt the old aches in his bones, the stiffness in his joints, but he pushed through it, driven by the thrill of the hunt and the knowledge that he was the only one who stood between the beast and the lives it would claim next. The trees began to thin, and the ground beneath his boots turned from dirt to gravel. He emerged from the woods, standing at the entrance to another town, this one larger than Grey Ridge. The main street stretched out before him, its shops and homes lined with old-fashioned streetlights that flickered in the gathering dusk. Jonas could already hear the screams echoing through the air, mingling with the sharp wails of sirens. He smelled smoke, saw the faint glow of fires spreading. The beast was already here, tearing through the town like a storm. Panic spread like wildfire as people ran, their faces twisted in terror, doors slamming, windows shattering. Creed smiled grimly, wiping sweat from his brow. "I got one more in me," he muttered to himself, gripping his shotgun tighter. He took off running towards the chaos. Ahead, he saw the creature in its full, monstrous form. It moved with terrifying speed, smashing through walls, dragging people from their homes, its eyes glowing with an unnatural, malevolent light. The werewolf was larger than any he'd ever seen. Its muscles rippled under its thick, matted fur, its claws sharp and deadly. Blood stained its jaws, its breath coming in deep, ragged growls. Jonas heard a crash above him, and he looked up just in time to see the beast burst from the top floor of a 3-story building. The werewolf leaped from a shattered window, glass and debris flying in all directions. It landed with a thunderous impact in the middle of the street, directly in front of him. Dust and rubble swirled in the air, and the beast rose to its full height, its eyes locking onto Jonas. Jonas stopped, a grin spreading across his face despite the gravity of the moment. "Well, looky here," he said, his voice calm, almost amused. "You are a big boy." The werewolf snarled, its lips pulling back to reveal rows of razor-sharp teeth, each one dripping with saliva and blood. It crouched low, ready to spring. Jonas didn't hesitate. He reached under his coat and pulled out his sawed-off shotgun, a weapon he had customized over years of hunting. The barrels gleamed in the dim light, loaded with a mix of silver pellets, blessed herbs, and powdered wolfsbane. He aimed directly at the beast's chest, his hands steady, his breath slow and measured. "Let's see how you like this," he muttered and pulled the trigger. The shotgun roared, a deafening boom that echoed down the street. The blast struck the werewolf dead on, slamming into its chest with a force that pushed it back several feet. The beast staggered, growling in pain, but it was hardly fazed. Its eyes burned brighter, filled with rage, and it shook its massive head, dislodging the smoking herbs and silver fragments embedded in its fur. Jonas chuckled. "You tough son of a gun," he said, flipping the gun open and loading another shell. "All right then, 1-on-1, the old-fashioned way." The werewolf snarled, and then it lunged. It moved with incredible speed, closing the distance between them in the blink of an eye. Jonas fired again, but the beast swiped the gun aside with a powerful clawed hand, sending it skittering across the pavement. The creature's other hand lashed out, catching Jonas across the chest. Claws ripped through his shirt, cutting deep, drawing blood. Jonas grunted in pain, but didn't falter. He reached for the silver knife at his belt and slashed at the beast's arm, drawing a line of dark, oozing blood. The werewolf howled, pulling back, its eyes blazing with fury. "Come on!" Jonah shouted, his voice fierce. "Let's dance!" The beast lunged again, its jaws snapping inches from Jonas's face. He ducked, rolling to the side, and jabbed the knife upward, catching the werewolf in the side. The creature roared, spinning around, its claws swiping at him. Jonas ducked and dodged, moving with surprising agility for a man his age, but he could feel his strength waning, his breaths coming in shorter, sharper gasps. The werewolf came at him again, and this time it was faster, more ferocious. It slammed into Jonas with the force of a freight train, knocking him off his feet. He hit the ground hard, his head smacking against the pavement. Stars exploded in his vision, and for a moment he felt the world spinning. He tried to get up, but the werewolf was on him. It grabbed him by the leg, dragging him across the street, its claws digging into his flesh. Jonas slashed at its arm again with the knife, but the beast was too strong, too fast. It flung him into a nearby wall, and he hit with a bone-jarring thud, feeling something crack in his ribs. Pain shot through his body, but he forced himself to stand. Coughing up blood. "That's all you got?" he spat, blood dripping from his mouth. "I've had worse from my ex-wife." The werewolf roared in rage and came at him again, this time with all its strength. It swiped its massive claws across his chest, cutting deep, and Jonas felt the searing pain as he was thrown back against the ground, his body broken and bleeding. He struggled to move, his vision blurring, his strength fading. The beast loomed over him, its hot breath washing over his face, its eyes filled with a savage triumph. It raised its clawed hand, ready to deliver the final blow. Jonas, gasping for breath, managed a weak smile. "Don't worry, big boy," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't expect to win this one." The werewolf hesitated, as if sensing something in his tone, but then its claws came down, tearing into Jonas's chest. He felt a white, hot pain, his body convulsing, his vision going dark. With his last breath, he spoke again, his voice a ragged whisper. "But I caught someone. Who does?" The werewolf paused, tilting its head, confused, but before it could react, Jonas's body went limp, his eyes staring blankly up at the darkening sky. He was gone. The beast stood over him, panting, its breath steaming in the cool night air. It let out a triumphant howl, the sound echoing through the ruined town, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in its eyes, a momentary hesitation. It sensed something, someone, out there, watching, waiting, and the hunt was far from over. Hours before his final encounter with the werewolf, Jonas Creed made his way to the old stone circle. The woods were thick with mist, the air cold and heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The ancient stones stood in the clearing like silent sentinels, covered in moss and etched with runes that seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly light. Jonah sat down on one of the stones, his breath misting in the cool night air. He pulled a flask from his coat pocket, taking a deep swig, and waited. He knew he wasn't alone. "Come on, Eldridge," he muttered to the darkness. "I know you're out there, lurking like the creep you are." A moment later, a shadow began to take shape in the mist, a figure emerging from the darkness. Eldridge, the ancient vampire, stepped forward. He was tall and gaunt, his skin pale as moonlight, his eyes dark as coal. He wore a long, tattered coat, that seemed to ripple around him like shadows themselves. Eldridge's voice was smooth, almost musical, with a hint of something otherworldly. "Jonas," he said, nodding in acknowledgement. "I heard your call. What madness brings you here to these stones on such a night?" Jonas smirked, tipping his hat. "I need your help, old friend. That thing out there, it's worse than anything I've faced before. It's not just a werewolf. It's something darker, something stronger." Eldridge sighed, his eyes narrowing with concern. "A lichen of this strength. My powers are useless against it. You know that, Jonas. I can't fight it for you." Jonas nodded, rubbing his grizzled chin. "I figured as much. But you've got other tricks up your sleeve, and I've got an idea that might just work. Something about how the damn thing got trapped in the first place. Tell me about the witch." Eldridge's expression darkened, and he stepped closer, his movements smooth and effortless, like a shadow gliding across the ground. "The witch, Isolde Blackthorn," he began, his voice low, almost reverent. "She was powerful, more powerful than any mortal should have been. She saw the destruction this beast could cause, the havoc it could wreak, and she made it her mission to imprison it. She used an ancient ritual, drawing power from the stones, from the moon, from the very earth itself. But she paid a price that bound her to this place, even in death." Jonas's eyes narrowed. "Can we bring her back?" Eldridge hesitated, his brow furrowing. "Summoning the dead is dangerous, even for me. Her spirit is tied to this circle, but to bring her back fully, to give her the strength she had in life, it would require a great deal of power, and the ritual would need to be performed with absolute precision." Jonas chuckled, a weary grin on his face. "Hell, I'm not here for my health, Eldridge. I'm here because I've got nothing left to lose. You do the fancy magic stuff, and I'll do what I do best. Kick a little ass and slow this thing down." Eldridge looked at him, a flicker of sadness in his ancient eyes. "Jonas, you know what this will cost you. You're already dying. The cancer. It's eaten you alive. You shouldn't even be here." Jonas shrugged, taking another swig from his flask. "I wasn't planning on going out in a hospital bed, hooked up to machines, pissing myself. Figured I'd rather go out with a bang, and maybe help save some folks in the process. So what do you say, old man? Can you do it?" Eldridge nodded slowly, a hint of respect in his gaze. "Very well, Jonas. I will help you, but know this. Once we start, there is no turning back." Jonas grinned, tossing the empty flask aside. "Never was one for turning back. Let's get to it." Eldridge stepped towards the stones, his hands raised, and began to chant in a language that was ancient, forgotten, a language that seemed to hum and vibrate in the air around them. The runes on the stones began to glow brighter, a soft, ethereal light that spread across the clearing. Jonas watched, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife, ready for whatever came next. Eldridge's voice grew louder, the words coming faster, more intense. The air seemed to grow colder, and a wind picked up, swirling through the trees, rustling the leaves. The light from the stones flared, and a mist began to rise from the ground, thickening, coalescing into a shape. A figure began to form in the mist, shadowy and faded at first, barely visible. Slowly it took shape, a woman, tall and thin, with long flowing hair, and eyes that seemed to burn with a fierce, unnatural light. Her form flickered and wavered, as if caught between worlds. But gradually, she began to solidify, her presence growing stronger. Jonas could feel the power emanating from her, a cold, raw energy that sent a shiver down his spine. "Isolde Blackthorn," he muttered, a hint of awe in his voice. "Damn!" The witch's eyes opened, her gaze fierce and commanding. She looked around, taking in her surroundings, and then her eyes settled on Eldridge and Jonas. Her voice was low and echoing, filled with ancient authority. "Who has called me from the shadows?" Eldridge stepped forward, bowing slightly. "I have, Lady Blackthorn," he said. "We need your help. The beast you once trapped is free again, and its evil grows stronger by the moment. We cannot defeat it alone." The witch's eyes narrowed, her form still flickering slightly. "I remember the beast," she said slowly, her voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "And I remember the price I paid to trap it. Why should I help you now?" Jonas stepped forward, his hand resting on his knife. "Because if you don't, it'll tear this world apart," he said simply. "And because I'm willing to give whatever's left of me to buy you the time you need to stop it." Isolde studied him for a moment, her eyes piercing, as if looking into his very soul. Then she nodded slowly. "Very well, mortal. I will do what I can, but know that the cost will be high." Jonas grinned. "Figured as much. I'm going to go on ahead, slow the thing down. You do your thing here. Eldridge, take care of her." Eldridge and Jonas exchanged a long, knowing look. For all their differences, they shared a bond forged in blood and darkness. They both knew this would be the last time they saw each other. Eldridge's face softened, a hint of sorrow in his ancient eyes. "Jonas, you've been a fool all your life, but a brave one. I'll see you on the other side." Jonas laughed, though it was tinged with sadness. "Take a drink of ale for me, you skinny bastard," he said, clapping Eldridge on the shoulder. "I'm counting on you." Eldridge nodded, his expression serious. "Go then. Do what you must." Jonas turned and walked away, his steps slow but steady. He knew this was the end, but it was the ending he'd chosen, the one he'd wanted. He would go out fighting, just like he'd always lived. Behind him, Eldridge continued his chant, and the witch's form grew stronger, more solid, her power filling the air around them. Her eyes glowed with a fierce, fiery light, and she raised her hands, drawing energy from the stones, from the earth itself. She was ready to face the evil that had once eluded her, ready to try again and stop this monstrous lichen. Jonas disappeared into the darkness, his figure growing smaller, his steps resolute. The witch's power grew, and she became a solid entity once more, a force to be reckoned with, ready to battle the evil that had been unleashed upon the world. The hunt was far from over.